inauthentic liberation. Alright, so number 2 is inauthentic liberation. Inauthentic liberation, first and foremost, reinforces dehumanization. Right? Inauthentic liberation reinforces dehumanization. Right? So you can imagine that members of the oppressed group are fighting for their liberation, and the way they go about attaining, quote-unquote, their liberation is by dehumanizing those who have oppressed them. So the argument would be something like, the only reason they oppress them is because they oppress us is because they're inhuman, right? They're subhuman. They don't have any morals. They don't have any beliefs. They're hateful people, right? If I am in a state of dehumanization, right, and I attempt to not identify myself as being equal with the other, but being superior to the other, such that I get to a position where I'm elevated. I was dehumanized, right? I was dehumanized, now I'm elevated, and now I can dehumanize the other. Well, obviously all I've done is I've reinforced the banking concept, right? I've reinforced an institution of dehumanization. This is not an act of liberation, right? Going from a state where I'm dehumanized to a state where I'm dehumanizing another, right? Going from a state where I'm dehumanized to a state where I'm dehumanizing another because I've elevated myself. Now I become superior, they become inferior. Here, they're superior, I'm inferior. Doing this only reinforces the act of dehumanization, and this is not an act of liberation, right? This would be identified as inauthentic liberation. The act of liberation isn't authentic because what has happened is that I've maintained the imbalance of power. I've maintained the imbalance of control between members of the oppressed group and the oppressor. The only thing that's happened is those who were oppressed are now the oppressor. Those who were the oppressor are now oppressed, right? I haven't liberated anything. I've reinforced the same institution. And quite often, to be honest with you, this is the fundamental flaw of quote-unquote movements, right? These movements pop up and they say that they're there to liberate the people and to help the people, but the very argument for the whole liberation movement is to reinforce imbalances in power. It's just that I'm in a position where I don't have power. I want power so that I can dehumanize another group, right? You haven't liberated, there is no movement, right? And Freire would say that that's inauthentic liberation. The next point is inauthentic liberation is based on the banking concept of education, and we talked about that before, right? So this is based on the banking concept. Okay, so it's based on the banking concept. And then lastly, which I've explained, that should be clear now. And then lastly, it's based on the transferal of information, right? Not the transformation of information, but the transferal of information. In the banking concept, what we have is a transferal of information. The educator is said to have some knowledge. The educator gives that knowledge to the student, makes a deposit. That information has that, the student then has that information, has that knowledge, and what we end up having is a transference. Right? We have a transferal of information. So for Freire, the banking concept really is a static concept, right? It's a static pedagogical device. There is no generation, there is no creation of information. The student merely regurgitates the information that the instructor gave him. I tell the student, you know, for your test you need to know bullet points 1 through 5. Test time comes, they tell me bullet points 1 through 5. If they get 5 of them, great. If they get 4 of them, they miss points, and so on and so on and so on. In the problem posing concept is different. It's not a transferal of information, it's a transformation of information. You have an educator, you have your student, the educator has knowledge, the educator imparts and essentially makes a deposit of knowledge to the student. The student conceptualizes that information and gives that information back to the instructor as something different. Right? So the student now thinks of, student gets knowledge K gets deposited, student thinks about that information K, but processes that information based on his or her existential experience, his or her life experience. As a black male in the 21st century, the information that I got was internalized based on my experience, right, which will be different from somebody from a different demographic. That information is then given back, and you can see that information is transformed, right? So this is explicitly the transformation, right? So it's not a transferal of information, it's a transformation. The transferal of information is the banking concept. The transformation of information is the problem-posing concept, right? And that's what education should be about. At its finest, it's a transformation of information, not just a regurgitation of, you know, sort of processed, memorized data, right? Robots can do that. Okay, so that explains the two forms of liberation. The first form being authentic, the second form being inauthentic. Obviously, what we're attempting to do is to aim at authentic liberation. The problem-posing model, now that we understand what the banking concept is, and we'll, in subsequent videos, go into even more detail on the banking concept, we need to sort of flesh out, to understand, to give some substance to the notion of the problem-posing model, right? So the problem-posing All right. So the first thing in the problem-posing model is that the teacher-student contradiction must be dissolved, right? We have to eliminate, we need to dissolve the teacher right? We need to dissolve the teacher-student relationship, right? That relationship of instructor with information, passive student with no understanding needs to be dissolved. Why must it be dissolved? Because the student never has the ability to transform information. The student only has the ability to transfer or transmit or receive information. Okay, so we need to dissolve that. The next point is that the teacher becomes, accepts this dual role, right? Instead of just being classified as a teacher properly, in the problem-posing model, the teacher becomes what's known as the teacher-student, right? The sort of hyphenated teacher-student, right? So the teacher becomes the right? In the problem-posing model, the teacher becomes the, as sort of one phrase, the teacher-student. And this should be obvious, right? We have a state where we have formerly a teacher and a student, and that information was given to the student, right? So that's the role of the teacher, right? So this is obviously, this direction is the teacher. However, there's information, this transformation of information is directed back towards the teacher, and this is where the teacher learns something, right? And has a deposit of his or her own, right? So this is a student. So we see that with respect to this subject, this direction is me educating this person, this direction is me being educated by this person, so that the teacher now becomes the quote-unquote teacher-student.